What if the most terrifying thing in a post-apocalyptic world wasn't the infected roaming the streets, but the place that promised to keep you safe from them? Because in 28 years later, the moment our characters step beyond the shattered barricades and into the so-called sanctuary known as the Bone Temple, the film quietly shifts from survival horror into something far more disturbing. And before we decode its meaning, ask yourself this question very carefully. When civilization collapses, who decides what safety really looks like, and at what cost does it come? Because this is True Terror Files Official, where we uncover the hidden horrors buried beneath familiar stories. And if you're drawn to unsettling truths, psychological fear, and the dark side of human survival, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the terror here doesn't fade when the screen goes dark. And as the world of 28 years later unfolds, we're introduced to a Britain long stripped of order, hope, and moral certainty, where survival has become routine and compassion a liability. So when the survivors discover the fortified compound known as the Bone Temple, the audience is meant to feel relief, a sharp contrast to the chaos outside. Solid walls, controlled entrances, disciplined soldiers, and a sense of structure that mimics the old world. But almost immediately the film begins whispering that something is wrong, not through jump scares or violence, but through stillness, symmetry, and silence. Because the temple doesn't feel lived in, it feels curated, preserved like a monument. And that's where the dread begins, as the camera lingers just a moment too long on bone-like architecture, ritualistic layouts, and watchful eyes that don't blink, creating a slow-burning tension that tells us this place wasn't built to protect humanity, it was built to redefine it. The true horror of the Bone Temple isn't revealed through dialogue or action, but through its design, because architecture in 28 years later functions as psychological storytelling, and every corridor, chamber, and threshold is carefully constructed to communicate control, dominance, and submission, as the cold stone walls resemble exposed skeletons, stripped of warmth or individuality, suggesting that this structure was never meant to shelter people as individuals, but to house bodies as resources. And when we examine the layout closely, we notice how the temple's spaces become progressively more restrictive the deeper one goes. Wide outer areas narrowing into claustrophobic inner sanctums, mirroring the loss of freedom experienced by those inside, while the outside world, though dangerous, remains open and unpredictable. The temple is rigid, sealed, and absolute, reinforcing the idea that authoritarian safety is often more suffocating than chaos. And even the absence of decoration becomes symbolic, because without art, memory, or signs of personal history, the temple erases identity, reducing survival to obedience. And this environmental storytelling is amplified by the surrounding landscape, where barren land and ruined civilization frame the temple as a lone structure of order, making it appear almost sacred. Yet its resemblance to a shrine built from remnants of death transforms it into something ritualistic and unsettling, as though humanity didn't just survive the apocalypse here, but entombed its conscience within these walls. What makes the Bone Temple truly horrifying is not its walls, but what those walls allow people to become. Because within its confines, the soldiers who were once defenders of humanity gradually transform into enforcers of cruelty, not through madness, but through routine. As the film explores a chilling idea that evil doesn't always erupt violently, sometimes it settles in quietly, institutionalized and normalized, and the temple's environment accelerates this transformation by removing accountability, isolating its inhabitants from the outside world, and replacing moral judgment with hierarchy. where orders override empathy and survival justifies exploitation, turning people into commodities. And the most disturbing aspect is how calm it all feels, as atrocities are carried out, not with rage, but with procedure, suggesting that when humanity abandons shared values in favor of controlled survival, monsters don't need to look monstrous, they just need permission. And the temple becomes a psychological incubator where power thrives in isolation, reinforcing the film's message that the real contagion isn't infection, but ideology, spreading silently from structure to soldier, from rule to routine, until cruelty becomes indistinguishable from duty. The collapse of the Bone Temple is inevitable, because structures built on domination rather than cooperation cannot sustain life. And when the illusion of safety fractures, what remains isn't liberation, but trauma, as survivors like Jim and Selena escape not just a physical place, but a psychological nightmare that reshapes their understanding of humanity forever. Because the temple leaves scars that no barricade can protect against, teaching them that survival without ethics is simply a slower form of extinction. And the film uses their escape to emphasize that hope doesn't come from walls or weapons, but from preserving compassion even when the world no longer rewards it. And this is where the temple's meaning sharpens into a warning, showing us that in desperate times, the temptation to trade freedom for safety can lead to systems more dangerous than the threats they claim to protect us from, making the Bone Temple less of a failed sanctuary and more of a mirror reflecting humanity's willingness to sacrifice its soul to survive another day. Long after the credits roll, the Bone Temple lingers in the mind because it represents a fear far more relevant than zombies or infection. The fear that in moments of collapse, humanity's greatest threat is itself. And this concept has influenced countless post-apocalyptic stories that followed, where fortified sanctuaries hide authoritarian regimes, false utopias, or moral decay behind promises of order. And in a world still grappling with questions of power, control, and security, the temple resonates as a chilling metaphor for how easily fear can be weaponized to justify cruelty, reminding us that structures, systems, and institutions are never neutral. They reflect the values of those who build them. And that's why the Bone Temple remains one of the most terrifying locations in post-apocalyptic cinema. Not because of what lurks inside it, but because of what it reveals about us. And if this breakdown changed how you see 28 years later, or made you question the true cost of survival, make sure to like, subscribe, and join True Terraphiles Official, where we don't just watch horror, we decode it, because sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we build to feel safe. Forget the rage virus for just a moment, because what if the most terrifying thing in 28 years later isn't the infected at all, but something far more deliberate, far more human, and far more revealing about who we become when the world collapses? Because buried within the film's haunting imagery is the Bone Temple, a grotesque structure that feels less like a shelter and more like a warning carved into history itself. And before we go deeper, ask yourself this unsettling question very carefully. When survival is all that matters, what parts of humanity are we willing to leave behind? Because this is True Terraphiles Official, the channel where we don't just watch horror stories, we dissect what they say about us. So if you're drawn to psychological terror, hidden meanings, and dark cinematic mysteries, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the scariest truths are always the ones hiding in plain sight. And as 28 years later expands, the universe first introduced in 28 days later and 28 weeks later, we return to a world devastated not just by infection, but by decades of moral erosion, where cities lie hollow, governments are myths, and survival has replaced civilization. So when the Bone Temple appears, it immediately feels different from anything we've seen before. Not chaotic like the infected, not accidental like the ruins, but intentional, constructed, preserved, suggesting that long after society fell, someone had time, control, and purpose. And that purpose wasn't rebuilding the world we lost, but shaping something new from its remains. The Bone Temple doesn't feel like the aftermath of violence. It feels like the result of planning, and that distinction is what makes it so disturbing. Because unlike the infected, who are driven by uncontrollable rage, the temple implies patience, cooperation, and shared belief, raising the horrifying possibility that humanity didn't just survive the apocalypse, it adapted to it in the most grotesque way possible, transforming destruction into ritual, structure, and meaning. And when we consider its design, the symmetrical arrangements, the deliberate use of remains as architectural elements, and the almost ceremonial layout, it begins to resemble a monument rather than a shelter, suggesting that whoever built it wasn't just trying to live, but trying to say something, perhaps about power, dominance, or permanence. And this shifts the horror away from disease and toward ideology, because the rage virus strips people of control, but the Bone Temple represents people who chose control, who embraced a new moral framework where life is reduced to material and symbolism matters more than empathy, turning survival into spectacle. And in doing so, the temple hints that humanity's darkest evolution isn't becoming animalistic, but becoming purposeful in its cruelty. Throughout history, humanity has built monuments from suffering, structures designed to intimidate, warn, or immortalize power. And the Bone Temple fits disturbingly well within that tradition, because it echoes real-world examples where fear was weaponized into architecture, reminding us that atrocities don't require chaos, they require belief. And the temple feels like a belief system made physical, one that suggests the apocalypse didn't erase culture. It distilled it down to its most primal instincts: dominance, hierarchy, and ritual. And when survival stretches across decades, desperation can transform into doctrine, turning necessity into ideology and ideology into art, where what once would have been unthinkable becomes normalized, even revered. And the Bone Temple becomes a philosophical statement carved into the ruins of civilization, asking whether progress is truly linear, or if, under pressure, humanity inevitably circles back to its most ancient impulses, proving that technology and intelligence don't prevent barbarity, they simply give it new forms, more efficient, more symbolic, and more terrifying. By introducing the Bone Temple, 28 years later radically reshapes the stakes of the franchise, because no longer is the primary threat a virus that might burn itself out, but a human culture that has learned to thrive in the aftermath, suggesting a new antagonist far more complex than the infected, possibly a faction, a cult, or an entire generation raised without memory of the old world, for whom this grotesque structure represents order, identity, and meaning. And this redefines survival in the 28th universe, because escaping infection is no longer enough. Survivors must now navigate moral landscapes where humanity itself has splintered into unrecognizable forms, each with its own rules, beliefs, and justifications. And the Bone Temple stands as evidence that long-term survival may require choices so extreme that they permanently fracture what it means to be human, turning the apocalypse from a temporary disaster into a permanent transformation. Ultimately, the Bone Temple is terrifying not because it exists in a fictional future, but because it feels plausible, because it reflects a truth we often avoid, that when stripped of laws, oversight, and shared values, humanity doesn't automatically choose compassion. and 28 years later seems poised to confront that truth head-on, suggesting that the real monster was never the rage virus, but the latent potential within us to rationalize cruelty when survival is on the line. And the temple becomes a mirror, forcing us to ask whether civilization is a natural state or a fragile agreement constantly at risk of collapse. And as the franchise moves forward, the Bone Temple may stand as its most chilling symbol yet, a prophecy carved from ruin, warning us that the future's greatest horror won't be what destroys us, but what we willingly build from the wreckage. And if this breakdown made you see 28 years later in a darker, deeper way, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join True Terror Files Official, where we don't just explore horror stories, we uncover the unsettling truths they reveal about humanity itself. Imagine stepping into a world where darkness doesn't simply hide danger, but actively observes you, where silence feels intentional and shadows seem to lean closer when you're not looking. Because in the universe of the Bone Temple, survival isn't measured by how long you outrun monsters, but by how long you can endure the presence of something that wants you aware of its existence. And before we descend into this oppressive world, ask yourself this unsettling question. What happens when the environment itself becomes your enemy? Because this is True Terror Files Official, where we analyze the hidden rules of horror worlds and uncover what they reveal about fear, survival, and the human psyche. So if you crave deep lore, psychological terror, and unsettling theories, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because some worlds don't let you leave once you understand them. And from the very foundation of the Bone Temple's lore, it's clear that this universe operates on layered threats, not a single antagonist, but a network of dangers that work together. Environmental decay, unseen entities, and psychological erosion, all reinforcing one another, creating a reality where safety is temporary and awareness is a curse. And unlike traditional horror settings, the Bone Temple world doesn't rely on sudden violence, but on constant pressure, an atmosphere designed to exhaust the mind, making every decision feel fatal, and every moment of rest feel undeserved. Among the most disturbing aspects of the Bone Temple universe are the entities that Dante announced themselves, the ones that exist at the edge of perception, beginning with the Shadow Blight, a mutating presence that doesn't merely attack physical bodies, but adapts to fear responses, growing stronger in low-light environments and reacting to emotional distress as if it can sense vulnerability, suggesting an evolutionary intelligence shaped by prolonged exposure to human terror. While deeper within the temple's domain, survivors report encounters with the Whispering Constructs, unmoving figures embedded into architecture, whose faint murmurs vary depending on who is listening, raising the terrifying possibility that they are not broadcasting messages, but reflecting suppressed thoughts back into the mind. And looming over all theories is the Eye of Oblivion, an unseen force believed to influence spatial distortion and behavioral changes, not through direct control, but through prolonged observation, slowly reshaping decision-making patterns and survival instincts, leading many to speculate that the Bone Temple does not simply house entities, it cultivates them, creating a symbiotic ecosystem where fear fuels intelligence and intelligence deepens fear. Even without entities present, the Bone Temple world remains hostile, because its environments are engineered by decay itself, starting with the bleak frost wastelands, where temperatures fluctuate unpredictably, ice shifts without warning, and deep fractures hide beneath thin layers of snow, turning every step into a calculated risk. While further inward, explorers encounter zones saturated with ethereal miasma, a dense atmospheric corruption that degrades equipment, disorients perception, and slowly erodes emotional stability, creating the illusion of time distortion and causing survivors to lose track of how long they've been exposed. And perhaps the most psychologically devastating environment of all is the echoing labyrinths, a network of corridors that defy conventional geometry, where paths subtly rearrange themselves. Sound behaves inconsistently, and isolation becomes inevitable, not because one is physically trapped, but because prolonged exposure fractures spatial memory, leaving survivors unsure whether they are lost or being deliberately guided deeper into the temple's influence. What truly defines the Bone Temple universe isn't physical danger, but psychological collapse, because its greatest weapon is time, manifesting through conditions like despair, sickness, a slow-burning mental deterioration caused by prolonged exposure to hopeless environments, where motivation erodes and survival instincts weaken not from injury, but from exhaustion of purpose. And compounding this is the phenomenon of memory parasites, entities or effects that subtly alter recollections, causing survivors to question their identities, alliances, and past decisions, effectively isolating them from their own sense of self, while whisper-induced paranoia spreads among groups, as auditory hallucinations blur the line between internal thoughts and external influence, leading survivors to distrust one another, fracture alliances, and often self-sabotage escape efforts, reinforcing the idea that the Bone Temple does not need to kill its inhabitants directly. It simply allows them to dismantle themselves from within. Despite the overwhelming darkness of the Bone Temple world, fragments of resistance exist within the lore. Accounts of survivors who learned that brute force and constant movement only accelerate collapse, while adaptation, awareness, and emotional regulation offer slim chances of endurance, with particular interest surrounding the resonance shards, rare artifacts believed to stabilize perception and disrupt environmental distortions, though their true capabilities remain debated. As some theorize, they amplify willpower rather than provide direct protection, suggesting survival in this universe may depend less on escaping the Bone Temple and more on resisting its influence. Because perhaps the ultimate victory isn't destroying the core evil, but refusing to let it redefine what it means to be human. And if this theoretical breakdown reshaped how you view horror worlds and survival narratives, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join True Terraphiles Official, where we don't just explore terrifying universes, we map the rules that govern them, because understanding fear is sometimes the only way to survive it.